what are some suggestions that you would give to coach us? What are some of those main bullet points that maybe this is how you start, this is how to think about it?
Well, a couple of things come to mind as you're framing that. One is I'm really glad you went to that model that kind of talks about how these three different levels of leadership, supervisory, middle management, upper level management, job functions do change, but the human dynamic is central throughout. I said to a class yesterday, talking about leadership and some of the relational dynamics of leadership, I said, essentially, if you don't like working with people, find something other than leadership to do. There are different gifts that people have, folks that maybe are just love working on the technical side of things and disconnected from people. Usually human skills are needed even in those areas to one degree or another. But for leadership, it's kind of a non-negotiable, right? If you don't like working with people, find something else to do, right? Leadership is a human skill.
Well, welcome again to the Today Counts show. I have with me a distant friend, and I mean distant because he was my professor when I was working for my Master's of Divinity at Bethel Seminary. And I never really met him face to face, but we had a virtual relationship, and I really, really enjoyed my time in that class. He was teaching about leadership. I don't remember the name of the actual course, but Dr. Justin Irving. So Justin, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jim. It's just a joy to be able to have a brother that loves thinking about leadership with kind of thoroughly Christian perspectives, but that brings real value to the world around us. So I consider you a real like-minded, like-hearted brother on these topics.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I just look at all the years of the dumb stuff I've done as a leader and figure I have a lot to learn. And even though I teach leadership and coach leadership today all around the nation in both corporations, ministries, churches, and entrepreneurs, I'm just, I guess, an avid learner. I want to learn and I want to get better. You co-authored a book with another professor, Mark Straus, who also happened to be one of my professors. I took a New Testament class of some sort from Mark, and I found him to be extremely delightful. Plus, him and I see eye to eye. We're both short guys, and we literally physically see eye to eye. You wrote the book, Leadership in Christian Perspective, and then the subtitle is Biblical Foundations and Contemporary Practices for Servant Leadership. And I would imagine that you guys kind of assigned certain sections to one another, but you probably collaborated, I would assume, in some of the layouts. And I wrote down the table of contents, at least in sections. You have it broken down into three areas: authentic and purposeful leadership, the priority of people, and navigating toward effectiveness. That's a lot to bite off in one podcast, but I thought, what the heck? Why don't we give it a shot? When you think about authentic and purposeful leadership in your book and otherwise, what are the main tenets that you guys found in your research and in your teaching?
Yeah, and maybe just a kind of some big picture perspective that fed into these kind of 9 practices grouped in the 3 areas. This was not just something that Mark and I kind of thought off the top of our heads, like, let's write about these 9 things. This is based in some background research looking at what particular leadership practices among many rose to the surface in terms of having a predictively positive effect on team and organizational effectiveness. And so having that kind of research in the background gives us confidence that we're speaking of things that really do matter to organizations. But then we wanted to spend time thinking about these things beyond just stating them as a research priority. We wanted to think about them in terms of, what does the Bible have to say about these topics? And what do contemporary leadership researchers and authors have to say about these things? But then also getting to, what does this look like in practice? So a little bit of a big picture, but then when we dive into this model, it really starts with leaders. And I know that's a priority in terms of the way you look at your own leadership development model with the Lead Today community, that, self-awareness and self-leadership kind of are front page. And I think, again, from a Christian perspective, it's not hard to see this as a priority in Scripture. Paul says to Timothy and other contexts, watch your life and your doctrine closely, for if you do, you'll save both yourselves and your hearer. Or another place in Acts 20, where he says, watch yourself and the flock of God. And so these two things are tied, right? We can't care for the people we're leading well if we're not first paying attention to our own lives. And so those first 3 chapters are really trying to lean into the fact that we need to be healthy, we need to be growing, we need to be learning people to be able to effectively lead others. So we talk about modeling what matters, we talk about engaging in honest self-evaluation, and we talk about that those kinds of leaders are those who partner well with others in a collaborative environment. So happy to go down any one of those paths or all of them, but that's kind of the heartbeat behind that, beginning with authentic and purposeful leaders. We need to lead ourselves well before we can lead others well.
You triggered a memory in me, Justin, and I think it's Rima. Is it Sam Rima? Am I pronouncing his name? Exactly. I remember, I think he signed off on your book here, if I remember right. I thought he did anyway. But now that I think about it, he also, I think I was in one of his classes. As well. And in his class, I think there was a book called Inside Out, leading from the inside out, or something like that. And Sam seems to be intense. I remember that, and really hitting this topic hard. I think one of the phrases that we use at Lead Today in our curriculum is, if we're not self-aware and if we don't lead ourselves well, how can we lead others in a morally and an effective manner? And it's a bit provocative, the statement, but I think nonetheless something that we need to look at. Well, you talk a lot about modeling in this first section, and obviously modeling, I'm assuming, comes from a authentic perspective. Again, going with the title of this section, it's not modeling something in one space and not modeling it in another. It's having that integrity. Why do so many leaders find it difficult to be the same person? We know about adapting our leadership to the context. We understand. I think the listeners, I think we all understand that you can't just bring in your leadership style. Whatever, if somebody says I have a leadership style, we probably do have one, at least unconsciously. But leadership is more than bringing in a leadership style to something. It's looking at the context and trying to bring what's needed in the context. Why do you think we struggle with that, both from a place of consistency in our lives holistically, as well as this idea of servant leadership, what's needed, and therefore I adjust to what's needed? Mm-hmm. Did I make sense of that question?
Well, I'll try to address it, and you follow up as needed. I think sometimes it can be really wrong-headed motives, right? Somebody has something to hide, so they want to try to have this disconnect between their public and private life. So there are some kind of extreme examples where people really have things that they're trying to keep under the lid, right, and not public. Mm-hmm. I think for others, it's maybe a little bit more innocent, that they have sort of a false impression of what a strong leader is, or they have a false impression of what they think their people want out of their leaders. And over time, I just think it's really easy for leaders to get isolated, and that can be partly driven by a leader's own personal preferences or instincts. Sometimes it's the members of the organization that kind of want to keep their leader in this sort of pedestaled position, right? They want their leaders to be the the great men and women of history who have all the answers and don't have any problems, and you never let people see you sweat, and you have it all figured out. I just think that increasingly, and maybe it has to do with kind of our more connected world, increasingly we recognize leaders are real people who are leaning into life, and they don't have perfect answers to the challenges of organizations, but they should have meaningful and thoughtful answers that they're leaning into in the context of a collaborative environment. So we have pretty high profile leaders. I'm thinking here of the former CEO of Medtronics, Bill George, who's written a lot about authentic leadership. I'm thinking of an example we write about in chapter 1, Bob Curling of the Fastenal Corporation, who are really emphasizing we cannot fake it when it comes to leadership. We need to be people who authentically care about the things that we're leading, care about the people we're leading, and willing to set an example. The Fastenal example was just kind of a fun one to lean into because as he was trying to establish the company on a good financial footing in the early years, he capped his salary for 10 years because he wanted to say, I'm not asking you all to make sacrifices and me not make those. We're in this together. If we rise and fall together, so I'm going to lead the way in financial responsibility for our company. And there's a fun article about him referring to him as America's cheapest CEO, but it was really just about financially responsible leadership to help set the pace by providing an example and a model for others. So those are a few examples that come to mind. And I think for leaders that can get past this false perception of what a leader needs to be as a strong person who has all the answers, I think increasingly people are recognizing we need strong leaders who are real people who authentically show us who they are as they lead on agendas that are important for the community.
I'd like to get your opinion on something that I have been working on in theory, kind of like in my imagination, the first creation of an idea or a practice, and that it seems as though what can kind of come against this idea of transparency, authenticity, obviously within reason and wisdom, is that we all do it. I do it, but we say somebody's a good leader, someone's a young leader, someone's an experienced leader, someone's a bad leader. We have all these labels, and just my experience, I'm not sure I've enjoyed that process as much as maybe saying, this is Jim. He's married. He's got kids and grandkids. And in this situation, looking at it, I practiced pretty good leadership. In this situation, boy, I could have practiced better leadership. A little bit of a, not to take the leader off the hook, but to see leadership as a discipline, to see leadership as a skill set, to see leadership as a hard issue, certainly. So there's some incarnation there for sure. But how do we create separation where people are trying to lead, but they don't, they're just constantly feeling like a failure, that they're not measuring up? Because let's face it, how many leadership books come out every month telling us how to lead, how to do this? So am I a good leader? Am I a bad leader? What's your take on that, psychologically speaking?
Yeah, I think that kind of, especially, some of what you were talking towards in near the end of your comments reminded me of the language we sometimes used about the imposter syndrome, feeling like, do I really have what it takes to lead effectively? Which is connected to a category we might call leadership anxiety in general.
Okay.
Some of the themes that Mark Straus and I engaged, I think it was in chapter 2, are around this idea of self-differentiation.
Yes.
And that's a concept that it's not something that people talk about too much in sort of everyday language, but I've found that it's quite profound in terms of its leadership implications. So there are a few authors that engage it. Sort of historically, one of the first authors was Friedman in his book Failure of Nerve. And he provided kind of a theoretical discussion about this idea of self-differentiation, which for those that are interested in kind of the backgrounds of this, it connects to family systems theory and how we relate to one another, not in sort of triangles, but in dyads, going to people, not having things go sideways. But his whole point was leaders really can't do their job if they always have their finger to the winds of people's opinions around them, right? That there's a failure of nerve if they're always looking to the perspectives of others. So the point of self-differentiation is for leaders to get to the point where they can maintain a non-anxious presence. That doesn't mean leaders never are anxious, but their people need them to have a non-anxious, calm presence, and to have who they are as leaders not rooted and grounded in the shifting perspectives, whether that be praise and affirmation coming from people on one hand or criticism and critique on the other. If we're constantly pushed back and forth by the opinions of others, we really can't stand and be what we need to be for our community. So this idea of self-differentiation is very helpful. One of the little bit more accessible books that I point people to is called Managing Leadership Anxiety by Steve Cuss. And he's pointing to the reality that in some ways, like, anxiousness for leaders is a bit of a gift from God. And what he means by that is it's kind of a flag that reminds us that we are trusting on ourselves and our own strength than on God. Now, it's not that trusting on ourselves rather than God is the gift, but the anxiety is a flag to point out that we have some misplaced grounding in our life. And he sees that as an invitation to return to rooting ourselves in the gospel, trusting on God's work of establishing us, and that gives it has the potential of giving leaders, particularly Christian leaders, a sense of calmness in the midst of chaos around them. So that's one key issue, I think, is how are we not being just pushed back and forth by the opinions of everybody around us, but finding a place of stability from which we can lead with some emotional health and emotional grounding. I think those conversations about self-differentiation and maintaining a non-anxious presence are really key for leaders these days.
That's really strong, Justin. What I'm wondering is, it sounds like we're talking about insecurity in the individual. How does somebody who works, they work themselves up, so to speak, into the ranks of being a performer, a team leader, a manager, and then now that they get this leadership tag on them, and they kind of find out that leadership does have a lot of different aspects to management, in that it's certainly more abstract than management. It's you might even say it's involves a little more art and creativity in that. And so let's say one gets to that leadership level and they begin to recognize that, dang it, I'm insecure. How does someone recognize their insecurity? How do they begin to grow out of that place of insecurity, becoming, as you said, less anxious, having this self-differentiation, process going on? Because this phrase you used, failure of nerve, boy, that strikes at the core of leadership performance. And so if we're hesitant, or if we pulled it, or if we knee jerk, right, both of those things happen probably as a result of the things that you've just described. But how often in your work do you see this insecurity thing thriving in the leadership lane? And what can we possibly, what are some practical things that we can do to see ourselves grow beyond those things?
That's helpful. Well, first of all, I would say we should be gracious with ourselves in that process, right? If a person feels like they are dealing with an anxiousness or an insecurity or that feeling of imposter syndrome, they need to recognize they can feel like they're the only one on earth that deals with it, right? It actually is a pretty common thing for people to be struggling with. And so to be gracious with yourself, I think, is a good starting point. But then it involves taking time to really understand what are the things that aren't just important to other people, but are important to me as a leader? So I'm working on another book project coming out this year on kind of healthy leadership for thriving organizations. And there's a couple discussions that get into that in the book. So there's a chapter dealing with like crisis leadership and how do we lead in times of chaos and in crisis. And one of the points is to be able to lead effectively in moments of crisis, we kind of need to know who we are before the crisis, right? We need to understand what are the values and the convictions and the priorities that are grounding us, because oftentimes our response in a time of crisis, it doesn't mean it's easy, but the answers sometimes are actually pretty straightforward when we go back to our grounding principles, our values, our convictions, our beliefs, our priorities. So that doesn't mean that the leadership task is easy, but it becomes a little bit more clear when those foundational priorities are in place. So I would say, if a person has entered into that leadership role, they historically probably have been in a role where the priorities have been given to them, right? I need you to act on these priorities.
That would be the majority, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But when you get into the leadership role, it's like, oh, wait a second. Other people aren't dictating to me the priorities. I have to think about what the priorities are for this team. I need to think about the priorities for this organization, which gets into a little bit of soul searching. And so I mentioned Bill George earlier in his discussion of authentic leadership. So he talks about one of his 5 or so variables in his authentic leadership model is the conversation of purpose. And his point there is not that leaders of organizations shouldn't care about the purpose of the organization, right? Of course, if a person's leading a company or a church or a business, they should be able to affirm the values and purpose that are on the website. But he's saying it's more than that, like that the leader needs to say, what drives me? What's my purpose as a leader? And how does that inform the way I'm guiding the people who are under my care? And I just think that's hard work to really get at the core of what drives me. I need to find my voice. What are the driving stories that I have to bring to this organization? And sometimes that anxiousness, sometimes that feeling of insecurity, I think, is an invitation to say, okay, what really does matter to me as a leader? And how am I going to use those driving sense of purposes and values? How's that going to drive me in my work as a leader?
It sounds a little preachy, but as I'm listening to you, a thought comes to mind that maybe having convictions that have been whittled into values and then into priorities, maybe that is what empowers someone to have the moral high ground to lead. I don't think it's too harsh to say we pass people up every day that don't know their convictions. And if they don't know their convictions, they're in a harsh way, they're a bit lost. So it's difficult for them to lead anyone or anything. So, I think we just kind of hit on a pretty strong chord here, is that we might be able to say leaders are people of conviction, regardless of whether we're talking good convictions or otherwise.
Yeah.
A leader is somebody has not just have convictions, but they've worked on those convictions where they can articulate them in the sense of statement, values, and behaviors, and even begin to teach them to others, to see if they can align people to where they want to go. As we know, alignment is a big issue, which I know we'll hopefully get into here in a little bit. This first section is just, I've got so many things highlighted, throughout it. I'm in the section here about, collaboration, development of authentic partners. We go into a lot of that. And we could probably just have done a podcast on this topic, right? We could, but let's go ahead and bridge over to people.
Yeah.
Because when I get a phone call to start working with a client, I'm just going to take a anecdotal guess that I think it's probably about 70% is about part 2 in your book is people. a lack of people skills. Sometimes we call it the soft skills and what have you. So as you and Mark have dived in part 2, understanding the priority of people, what are some of the most important things that you would want to say in this podcast that kind of came out of that research and that study?
Yeah. Well, just to set up kind of the 3 practices in the second section, which is focusing on the priority of people. I did a survey with a number of executive leaders. I heard from about 215 executive leaders, asking them kind of what challenges that they're facing in their organizations, and then what their top recommendations are. And I'm thinking that one of the responses, as you asked that question about the second section, and it was a gentleman who he went up to the level of a general in the military, and now he is moving into his second university presidency. So this is a pretty high-profile leader in governmental and nonprofit higher education context. And he his sort of big piece of advice, he said, is if you want to take care of the mission, take care of your people. Right? So his point was the best way to move towards mission accomplishment is to make sure you're caring for and prioritizing the people who are going to deliver on that mission. Now that really gets at kind of some heartbeat convictions I have around leadership, and it gets to the heart of what differentiates servant leadership from other approaches. So it's not as if servant leadership or empowering leadership doesn't care about mission accomplishment. It's a conviction that says the best way to bring about that mission is to invest in the people who are going to deliver on that mission. And the second section of the book, this focus on the priority of the people, is all about leaders recognizing that. We're going to get to that third area of navigating towards effectiveness, but the way that happens is by prioritizing the number one asset of an organization, which is its people. And so we emphasize the practice of valuing and appreciating people, creating a place for individuality in the people of our communities, and then understanding the priority of relational skills, that at its core, leadership is a relational practice. And you talked about how the people you're interacting with in organizations and businesses are recognizing that it's those soft skills that differentiate people who are able to work well in the leadership capacity. So that first point of just starting with the value of people, we talk about valuing and appreciating. I differentiate those in saying it begins with valuing people. And that's not valuing them just because of what they produce in our organizations. It's valuing them as human beings. It's valuing them as people who are created in the image of God, that they have dignity and worth and value beyond what they deliver for a company. But that those people, that they're recognized and they're valued as people, also appreciate it when their gifts and work is appreciated. We're wired as workers. We are wired to add value to the people around us in our lives and in our work. And for leaders to take time to express that value and express that appreciation, it goes a long way in helping the people of our communities know that they're valued and appreciated. So that's a bit of how we start the conversation on prioritizing people, but it's really situated in that kind of broader frame that the best way to get to mission accomplishment is by prioritizing and caring for the people of our communities.
And I think you guys make that point too. On page 127, you have a chart, and I'm going to try to describe it to the listeners. It has 3 levels on the chart. The bottom level is called supervisory management. The next level is middle management. The next is top management. Yeah. And then you talk that, generally speaking, in a supervisory management role, the need for conception skills is generally low. I kind of implied that in our discussion earlier about abstract versus concrete. But one thing that you have on this lower level is that what is a must is high human skills. And paired with that would probably be more high technical skills. But then we pop over to middle management, and then the need for conceptual skills moves up to moderate, and the technical skills moves down to moderate, but the human people skill stays at the high mark. And then you move up to top management, and now you got high conceptual strategic skills needed at the highest level, and the technical skills drop down to low, but nothing changes with the human skills. They still got to be high.
That's right.
And that's just one thing I have noticed. One does not need to aspire to the C-suite to be a strong and effective leader. But many of those that I do meet up with in the C-suite have gotten there certainly by not having a limp in their walk when it comes to people skills. There's always exceptions. You know, sometimes you wonder how that bully got there. He probably got there by bullying himself there. But for the most part, I run into some exceptionally skillful people in those C-suites that have high human skills. Now that shouldn't be our why, but it does scream pretty loud why this is such an important topic. Earlier in the chapter, of course, you speak of Joseph, otherwise known as Barnabas, you know, and is given the nickname the son of encouragement. And I think you guys write in there that wherever you find him in the text, he always seems to be building a bridge, helping people understand one another, encouraging, equipping one another, and those kinds of things. This too is a pretty weighty chapter. What else would you want to highlight as where we begin? Because, you know, we might say, okay, we made the point, but what are some suggestions that you would give to coach us? What are some of those main bullet points that maybe this is how you start, this is how to think about it?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things come to mind as you're framing that. One is I'm really glad you went to that model that kind of talks about how at these three different levels of leadership, supervisory, middle management, upper level management, job functions do change, but the human dynamic is central throughout. I said to a class yesterday, we're talking about leadership and some of the relational dynamics of leadership. And I said, essentially, if you don't like working with people, find something other than leadership to do. Right. There are different gifts that people have, folks that maybe are just love working on the technical side of things and disconnected from people. Usually human skills are needed even in those areas to one degree or another. But for leadership, it's kind of a non-negotiable. Right. If you don't like working with people, find something else to do. Right. Leadership is a human skill, which is why we talk about in both chapter 2 and here in this chapter 6. We focus on emotional intelligence as one of the things that we can be nurturing in that soft skills area. And so I mentioned those two chapters because emotional intelligence has a self-leadership dimension to it, but also an interpersonal dimension to it. So we certainly need to begin by understanding our own emotions so we can respond to those. And, if we're having let's say we've had a horrible weekend with some really difficult family dynamics or something happening in the neighborhood or beyond, we can have hard times as leaders, but we need to not bring all of that into the work relationships, right? There needs to be a sense of knowing how to at times bracket out our own emotions in order to be focusing on other people around us. So it doesn't discount the emotion, but we need to make sure that emotions are a good guide, but they're a really bad dictator, right? We need to be aware of them, but not let them drive the ship. So same goes with working with other people, right? That we need to have an awareness of the whole person that we're working with, right? And part of that whole person is an emotional level. Are we seeing and responding to the emotions we see at others? We also talk in that chapter about not only emotional intelligence in engagement with others, but intercultural intelligence. That's another way of thinking about working with people who are coming from different cultural backgrounds. It's really almost a similar dynamic. It begins with awareness and then responsiveness to what we're aware of. And that can be as simple as somebody coming from a high power distance cultural background, another person coming from a low power distance. And for those that maybe aren't familiar with those terms, like, is there is that in the low power distance context, is the boss sort of have an open door policy and they're really accessible? You can talk to them, you can ask them questions, probably on a first name basis, or is there kind of a lot of deference given to the leader, a lot of hierarchy and separation between leaders and followers? I don't see those as right or wrong, but they are different. And so being aware of backgrounds that people bring emotionally, interculturally, allows us to be responsive then relationally in our engagement with those people.
What do you think about this? I often coach leaders in this way. I notice that a lot of folks just show up. They show up to work on Monday. They barely get into the team meeting, the committee meeting, the board meeting on time. You could just tell that their soul hasn't caught up to their body, so to speak. And a lot of my coaching is, whenever you do it, whether you do it early on Monday morning or you do it as the sun goes down on Sunday evening, take a look at your calendar, look at what you're facing, imagine yourself there. What do you know about that person, those people, the situation? How do you feel about it? How do you want to behave, during that time? These kinds of things. And then, of course, even in a more micro perspective, they might have their head down at the desk for an hour and a half. Get up and take a walk before you walk into that next meeting, because I just try to teach this. I think I actually learned this idea from somebody at some place in my earlier years, where my personal preferences would get in the way of my leadership, meaning that there's an event, there's a social event. I'm an introvert. I don't really want to go to the social event. But then when someone started explaining to me what I'm communicating by not going to the social event, that kind of woke up my consciousness to that. And then when I would go, everyone could tell I didn't want to be there. So then the next level was, okay, go there ahead of time. Think about the people that are there, their stories. Can you rise up to that and connect with people? Then I actually began seeing myself doing that ahead of time. I would never be great at it, but I would be sufficient at it, and people appreciated that, and it put leadership coin in my pocket.
Great.
Do you find that as valid coaching, or is it too mystic, or what do you think about that?
No, I don't think it's unhelpful at all. So back to kind of the leadership development model that you put forward, beginning with self-awareness. What you just described there was self-awareness, right? It's not wrong to be tired. It's not wrong to be introverted. It's not wrong to have preferences for which meetings you are excited to go to and which ones you're not. But to be aware allows you then to be responsive with those emotions and experiences, to say, I might not want to be at this meeting, but I do want to communicate care and love to the people who are here. So what do I need to do internally to align my ultimate values, right? Really, you really do care about people. So how do I align that value with the expression on my face, or the eye contact that I'm giving?
Right.
An example that is used in the book, I'm forgetting his name right now, but it was I think the former CEO or president of Southwest Airlines. There's a story we talk about where he's talking to this mechanic at a facility, and everybody's around him wanting to get his attention, but it's like he just doesn't even break eye contact with this employee. Yeah. And you imagine how that employee felt for the rest of his career there.
Right.
Like, I'm valued by the CEO.
Right.
And the point it reminds me of this Jim Elliott quote, wherever you are, be all there. That CEO is like, well, for the moment, this person in front of me is the most important person to me right now. And I think like leaders nurturing that sense of being present, not thinking about what else needs to happen in the future, being present in the moment with the people who are in front of you. It just, the way you described going to that meeting sounds a lot like being intentional with those kinds of decisions and the people who are in front of you.
And isn't that important, right? Being intentional. How many things do we do unintentionally? And some of them might be good because they're good habits, but in other ways we're causing, damage is a harsh word, but causing damage, not even realizing it because we're stuck in our own selves. Sometimes being a leader is just first learning some of those things that I was taught as a boy. Yes, sir. No, sir. Look people in the eye, shake their hand, clean up my room, make my bed, do my chores. I mean, there's sometimes there's just some basic, things that we can carry with us that move on. Well, I know that this next section, of course, is important to leaders everywhere because this is often what creates anxiety. This is what they're trying to figure out. This is what they're working on, what their mind is on. I try to slow them down as I try to slow down myself, to think about a healthy self, as we talked about, think about healthy relationships. And as much as the listener's trying to be patient, I know they're ready to go. They want the green lights to hit. What do we do? And so now what we do is we turn to this third section of yours, Mark's book, navigating towards effectiveness. Well, what the heck does that even mean? I'm going to set you up like that.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think most people would affirm that organizations exist to get things done. And, it's very rare that you have just purely a social club. But I think you could argue even in a social club, like think about a country club, there still is a mission. They're trying to create community. They're trying to create entertainment experiences, whatever the case might be. So there's always a mission of some sort that is driving where we need to be landing the plane. So everything we've talked about in the previous 6 chapters is sort of sequentially a priority, right? We got to get our own leadership, self-leadership in place. We need to prioritize people. But for ourselves and the people that we're leading, we all want to be a part of flourishing and thriving endeavor that are seeing the mission accomplished. And that mission is going to look different in a nonprofit or for-profit and other type of entities, but we have a mission that matters. And so this is about navigating that. So it begins with communication. We need to have clarity on what our mission is, where we're going, being clear on expectations around that. One quick little note about that communication chapter. It's my conviction that you can be an effective communicator and not necessarily be an effective leader, but it doesn't work the other way, right? To be an effective leader requires you to be an effective communicator.
I want you to say that again, because I think that's really strong.
Yeah, you can be an effective communicator and not be an effective leader, but it doesn't work the other way. To be an effective leader, you have to be an effective communicator. That doesn't mean you have to be comfortable speaking in front of 5,000 people, right? Communication takes place in mass levels, in small group levels, and dyadic levels. But we do need to be comfortable communicating a clear vision, a clear direction of how we're going to work towards that vision, and how we're going to treat people along the way in that journey. All of those are communication responsibilities. Leadership is I said it's essentially a relational practice, but because it's essentially a relational practice, it's a communicative practice as well. We need to know how to communicate well with other people. And lots of threads we could talk about.
Sure. One of my board members mentioned to me, we were chatting a couple weeks ago about this or that. And I know what we're doing. We were debriefing on a book that we were reading together as a board. And he said, you know what's missing in this? And he held it up. He says, communication. He said, communication. He said, if I've learned anything about leadership, man, so much of it is about communication. It's the hard work. It's the hard work. I think that's probably really true for abstract thinkers, because we tend to, at least this is my story. I don't know if you can connect with this. I can tell by the words that you use, and generally being a professor, you're going to be an abstract thinker as well. But, we're kind of speaking at an elevated way. What was I going to say there? Oh, yes. I noticed that my communication, my abstract thinking worked against me sometimes in 2 ways. One is I've already said this. So to say it again feels like I'm talking down to people. So I have to fight that, because vision leaks. it just leaks. That's just a fact. And until I really recognized that and embraced it, that vision leaks, did I become more committed to repeating myself, even though I felt weird doing it. Another example is that because the opposite side of the spectrum of humanity is you have the abstract thinkers and you have the concrete thinkers. I'm overgeneralizing, I know, but concrete thinkers, they want to hear details. They want to hear exactly, how do you want me to do this? How exactly are we going to do this? And if you delegate to me that way, I'm going to quit because I'm bored out of my mind. I want room to apply my own person, my own things to this. A concrete thinker wants to knock stuff out, get stuff done. And so they want to know what stuff they want done. And it's another example, I think, of communication. One more thing, and I'd love for you to unpack this even more. So a lot of times, eventually, an executive will say, okay, I can't deal with it anymore. I've got to hire an executive assistant. And Justin, a lot of this comes from experience, not my intelligence. It comes from my failures. I'll ask this question. Do you want an executive assistant that solves problems? Or do you want an executive assistant that gets stuff done? And they go, well, who wouldn't say both? And I say, that person does not exist. And what I try to explain is, and again, I'm being broad and I'm overgeneralizing, but when you're speaking to a concrete thinker, to delegate, it takes more time on the front end so that you can cover all those questions and details that person needs to know in order for them to go knock it out. But the great thing is, you do that on the front end, they're going to go knock it out, some project or whatever. But if you really don't care too much about how this is done and that is done, but you're just looking more at the results, then you kind of want that problem solver, that abstract thinker, let them do it. However, going back to self-awareness, so even once I got that through it in my thick head, then I realized that I probably care about more details than I think. And so I even had to reel that in because I was giving someone carte blanche when in reality I needed to give them boundaries to my decision. I can't imagine you haven't run into that in some way, shape, or form in your studies, your research, and your teaching. And I know you must be consulted on a lot of these concepts.
Yeah, I appreciate how you're framing a question back to the people you're working with, right? Well, when we're talking about this administrative support role, administrative assistant, let's clarify what we're looking at. One of the tools I've started using, like when I'm working in kind of a team building situation, is it's called the Working Genius. I don't know if you spent any time with that, but it's some newer work that Patrick Lenciani has been doing. But it's basically for those of you who are listening that maybe aren't as familiar with it, he walks through sort of, I think it's 6 categories on sort of a workflow process. And early on, you have people who are more like the innovative, creative folks that are coming up with the ideas. Then you have in the middle, the category, those who are sort of the implementers, those who are like, well, let's rally people to put this into motion and make it happen. And then you have those on the end that are kind of like, they're the ones that see it through to the end, right? And the innovators are bored at that stage, right?
Yeah.
But you need people who are coming up with the ideas. You need those who are rallying people and empowering people to implement the ideas. And you need those who are going to see it through to completion. And you're very rarely, kind of like what you're saying, you're very rarely going to find all of that in one person or even a couple people. You need to find a balance on your team. And so I typically, have a team take the assessment, and we'll do some other things too, like StrengthsFinder or Myers-Briggs, and then try to just like not only do sort of like an individual profile, but then like map it out on, put it up, project it. Here's what your team looks like across this workflow process, and where are the gaps? Where are the strengths? And if you're thinking about like hiring an assistant, boy, why not try to get somebody who's helping to build an area of weakness on the overall team? So that's some of what I've
Exactly.
kind of leaned into. Yeah.
As soon as you mentioned Pat and his work, I thought about, man, my brain just kind of exploded on one place it went to, and I want to talk to you about this in context to your third section. And I want to say it so I don't forget.
Yeah.
In his book, The Advantage, he talks about the research and the science behind having one goal, maybe two, but not three or more. I want to come back to that. But when you were describing his most recent work about the genius, and I'm probably going old school on us, but when I was in my 20s, I remember there was a man, I want to say his name was Bob Beal. Bob Beal, he was like a church leadership consultant, and he drew three parallel circles that overlapped. And I went ahead and drew those on my Remarkable here. And to the left, in the left part of that far left circle, he wrote the word creative. And then in that next section, he wrote creative developer. And then in the middle, he wrote developer. And then to the right of that, developer maintainer. And then finally maintainer. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, five different geniuses, if you will, which was really helpful for me because as I did my little test, I found that I was a developer. I kind of brought, I wasn't a maintainer. That would bore me to tears, but I wasn't super creative either. But when I saw a good idea, I could develop it and, bring it along. So I'm glad you brought that up because I think that fits pretty well into this third section. But if we go another layer with Patrick's work, have you seen that as well, where, you walk into a company and you look at their strategic plan for the next 12 months. And I realize it's a different discussion for different sizes of companies. Patrick would say no, but I think that the business world would want to argue back and say size does, make a difference. But I'm interested to know, have you come across any personal studies or with others that one goal is possible and you do get more done with one goal versus two goals versus three, et cetera?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a strong conviction on that. Certainly not as strong as Lenciani puts forward. I do think, when we're talking about some of the broad categories of organizational culture, and I think we engaged even some of this back in the coursework that you did with me 20 years back or so. But needing to differentiate things like purpose and mission and vision. A lot of organizations kind of use those terms interchangeably almost sometimes. But I think of them around questions. And this is a little bit similar to Lenciani. So in The Advantage, he kind of has a question-based approach to thinking about culture as well. We don't use the exact same question, but it's a similar idea where I see purpose answering the why questions. Why do we exist as an organization? Missions answering the what question. And on mission, at least, that's where having that singular focus, I think, really becomes pronounced for the community. We might have different departmental emphases that are being lived out in unique ways, but they all need to be tied back to that central focus of the organization. So this isn't goal specifically, but mission specifically, it needs to not be diffuse. It needs to be very centralized as we're kind of having the detailed strategy dimensions of our work being aligned with that singular mission.
Okay, I have a question on that. What's the question for vision?
I see it as a what if or a where question.
Okay. I like that. What if? I hadn't heard the what if before. I've heard the where before. Now, is it possible that the company as a whole, and we're just brainstorming here.
Sure.
The company as a whole has one main goal for the next 3 years. And the mission, and let's say there's 3 divisions that support this company. Is it possible that the mission of each of those is to answer the question, what are we going to do to help accomplish that goal? Or am I getting things mixed up?
No, that sounds helpful, right? There needs to
Okay.
be a kind of a tailored answer for those divisions. But again, it's not a different animal, right? We need to be working on the same page. So I'd mentioned before this other project that I'm working on, and so of the four stages in the leadership development model, you have the self-awareness, self-leadership, leading others. That's really what the book we're talking about today is focused on. The other project is that, leading healthy organizations. And so in there, there's a chapter that I'm kind of painting this broad model of culture that I'm emphasizing in terms of leading others. And connected to that is how do we see teams empowered in that organizational environment that are aligned with that broader culture? So there's a chapter where I'm focusing on that priority of alignment. And of course, any organization is needs to resist these little mini kingdoms emerging in different departments and areas. An organization, if it's going to be a single organization rather than sort of multiple organizations under a parent company or something like that, if it's a single organization, there needs to be an argument for how all of these are aligning behind that common mission. And that takes some hard work to make sure that we're pulling in the same direction. There's going to be uniquenesses to each division, each team, but there needs to be an argument for how they are working collectively towards that common agenda as an organization.
I'm glad that you also brought up that there's a differentiation between purpose and mission, because I know again from working with so many that in fact I rarely see purpose even used. I see it mostly used in individualizing one's direction in life or whatever. But I also have heard someone use to help people understand purpose and mission, not just the why and what, but purpose is unchanging. Mission can be mission is consistent, but it can change more than purpose. And then one of the examples that I think I heard was, if you think of the U.S. military, their purpose has something to do with our borders and our Constitution, protecting those, right? And someone might throw in democracy too. I'm not sure that was the original intent, but if you throw those three arrows through the ball of purpose, our borders, our democracy, and the Constitution, although there's redundancy there, I guess.
Sure.
And however, how many missions is the military on? Right. That would be the idea. But I think it's important that we see the significance of those two words. They're not the same.
Yeah.
They can add more culture to what it is that you're trying to do. Yes.
Yeah, and if I can, let me kind of inject another element to this.
Yeah.
I try not to be overly prescriptive with churches and businesses and organizations about the label they put on things, right? I don't think it ultimately matters to the public whether it's called a vision statement or purpose statement or mission statement, something like that. My point is, the people of our organizations and the people that interface with our organizations need to know that we have answers to these questions. Why do we exist? What do we do? Where are we going? What are the values and beliefs that we have? What's our core strategy? So the various questions would be the who questions, the what questions, the how questions, the where question, right? To make sure that there are answers, compelling answers to those things. And sometime an organization might have an answer to the who and the what question baked into one statement. I remember a church. Well, you mentioned Leith Anderson, at least in a previous conversation. At Wooddale Church, at least historically, I forget if they called it a purpose statement or vision statement, but it said, "We exist to glorify God by making more disciples for Jesus Christ." Well, in a very short, succinct statement, they're answering the who and the what question really quick to their people. And again, I don't care what label people put on it, but we need to have compelling answers to those questions that people are bringing to the enterprise.
Yeah, and again, I'm glad you mentioned Leith. I enjoyed his perspective. I can think of two things that I think is worthy to mention in our podcast that Leith can contribute to our conversation. One of them is a funny story that he said. He said that when he started there as pastor, there was 1,200 people, and a year later there was 600. And somebody in our cohort raised their hand and said, "What happened?" And without hesitation, Leith says, "They didn't like me." And of course, the church at that time was well into the thousands, and thousands. But so he had talk about a guy who was self-aware and could call it. But then the other thing I remember is his introduction to the Doctorate of Ministry program. He did a 6-point PowerPoint, which I came up to him afterwards and said, "Can I steal this?" And that was, again, we're talking darn close to 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And he said, "Sure, you can have it." And I rebranded it and I still use it today. But his first of 6 points was, leaders do what needs to be done. I was so disappointed when I heard that, because at first blow, I thought, what does that even mean? And then he went into his commentary and I went, oh, wow, that is so powerful. Leaders do what needs to be done. It's not, leadership is not necessarily about what you do well. It's not what you want to do. It's not what you would like to do. It's not what you can do. When it really comes down to it, leaders got to do what needs to be done. And he, probably gave a good 10-minute dissertation on that one point. At first I was disappointed, and then I couldn't write fast enough, and what he was saying. Well, what else would you add to this, this concern? I know that I wrote down the word alignment, because one of the things, Justin, that I teach in my work is that most likely we don't even know it, but when we walk into a new environment, when we walk into a new team, we're out of alignment. And if we can say that to ourselves, it might give us more of a learning posture, more of an empathetic posture, and others might find it refreshing that we're not just coming in and saying, here I am, ta-da, and here's what I add to the team, but really, create that. And isn't that what the onboarding process is supposed to help us with, is to help people align, ask questions. But in your work, it's your life. You are the professor of leadership. You have earned your doctorate in this arena, right? In the study of leadership, and you teach it now. It's your life. It's your ministry. It's your profession. How big of an issue is alignment, and what are the main tenets that you teach about that?
Yeah, let me, in answering that question, let me touch on a couple more points from that third section of the book.
Yes, please.
Because alignment, I think, really is driven by that language of clarity from chapter 7. So David Horsager, he wrote the book, The Trust Edge. He argues that people trust what is clear and they distrust what is ambiguous, right? So people need clarity, and alignment, sort of the headwaters of alignment, is being clear with ourselves, with other people, on what matters most, and how are we aligning ourselves behind that clear communication. And then out of that clear communication, then when we really have focused on what is clear, what is known, what do people understand because it's been clearly communicated, then we can move into having accountability conversations. And accountability is natural for some leaders. It's difficult for a lot of leaders. And the point, I think, of simplifying the accountability conversation is we shouldn't be catching people off guard. Expectations should be clear, right, between leaders and followers. Here's what this role entails. And accountability conversations really then begin to talk about gaps between clear expectations and observed behavior, which is not always fun, but that actually is what's needed to have healthy working relationships and healthy organizations. So the former president of Panera, he used the language of saying, early on in my career, I thought servant leadership was about being nice at all costs. And I finally figured out that servant leadership is actually about being helpful at all costs. And if we want to not just be nice, but we want to be helpful, that means we need to have some direct conversations at times about gaps between expectations and behavior or practice. So that's really the heartbeat of the accountability chapter. And then that flows into the final chapter of supporting and resourcing. So we've made the mission clear and how we need to be aligned behind that clear mission, clear goals, clear expectations. We hold people accountable to that, and that doesn't exempt leaders. Leaders are accountable in systems as well. But then we move to that final chapter saying, once the mission is clear, once we're holding people accountable to that, then it's time for leaders to do everything they can to support and resource their people towards success. And I use the example of Stephen Sample, who used to be the president at the University of Southern California, who he received some advice from a mentor early on in his leadership that said, Steve, 10% of your time is on the basics of leadership, hiring the right people, holding them accountable, doing assessment. But really, 90% of your role is doing everything you can to make sure they succeed at their jobs. Your job is to become sort of first assistant to the people who work for you. And that really flips the pyramid on its head. It's servant leadership in action to say, no, a majority of my time is devoted to making sure you, the people who are my direct reports, are succeeding in your jobs.
Well, I think you just answered the alignment question. I mean, if we are clear in our vision, we're providing accountability, and we have short accounts, constantly seeking to resource and support people towards their success, that's going to go a long way, assuming that you have a cooperative and collaborative individual, that you're working with. Justin, this was outstanding. We just scratched the surface of your book. I wrote down on another page, I've got like 5 pages of notes here that we have been going through. But the word that I would give towards the book that you and Mark put together is comprehensive. I think it's a comprehensive look at leadership. For the listeners, you can still get this book on Amazon, I'm sure. It is entitled Leadership in Christian Perspective. The authors, Justin A. Irving and Mark Straus, 2 fantastic men that I respect and love. And I have some of Mark's commentaries in my library as well. Thank you so much, Justin. I really appreciate the contribution that you just made today to our community of leaders, and I know it will be very much appreciated. And if it's okay, I would love to continue this conversation. Maybe come on again for another podcast, and we could take a topic and go deep.
Well, that sounds wonderful. I just really feel like we are kind of like-minded people in terms of how we think about leadership, and really driving to resource people to be healthy leaders and to lead healthy and thriving organizations. And that brings good to the world around us. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing in the Lead Today community.